We're back.
We're back, and I hope we're not going to have any technological problems this time.
I hope so too. It was kind of sad for it to, dwindle out like that.
Yeah, I'm sorry.
Well, it's not. It could have been me. Who knows? We don't know. Oh,
So we're just going to wait until 3 o'clock on the dot.
yeah. I'm glad I pinned all the people attending were coming in at the same time as I was trying to pin it, and I thought, oh, I think I pinned the wrong comment, but I think it's okay.
No, I think you did well. Yeah.
Yeah. It's 3. Shall we start?
Sure.
Okay. So, hi everyone. Thank you so much for coming. I'm Erika Dolphin. I'm an associate curator of European art here at the National Gallery of Canada. And I'm here today as part of the weekly house blend that we're running on Instagram Live at the National Gallery with NGC curators and invited guests, and just in time for your afternoon break. And we're here in English on Thursdays at 3 et en français les jeudis à 13h. So please grab a mug and join us. I just have water. Kind of parched doing this, so water is what I have today. Today I'm doing, what do you, same thing?
Yeah.
Yeah. Nothing exotic. I'm joined in this virtual space with my colleague, Sonia Del Rey, who's Senior Curator of Prints and Drawings at the National Gallery of Canada. And we come to you from our homes somewhere in the Ottawa Valley on unceded Algonquin territory. And we're here to talk to you today about sex and violence in Greco-Roman myths and European art. But before we get started, I'll give you the format. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes, and then we'll stop with 10 minutes to go and answer some questions. So we invite you to start posting them as we go in the comments section, and we'll tackle them at the end. So our topic today is something that you and I have discussed on a number of occasions back in the time we're actually in our building, when maybe not on a coffee break, but maybe, you know, we knock on each other's doors every now and then when we need to kind of hash things out. And this is one of those topics that we wanted to hash out. So to set the stage for our audience, our discussions began when you were looking at your because of your touring exhibition called Beautiful Monsters, Beasts, and Fantastic Creatures in Early European Prints, which runs the gamut of the 15th and 16th century mostly. And it was traveling in Canada, across Canada from 2013 to 2015. And finally in 2019, you had a chance to display it at the National Gallery of Canada. And as you were getting ready to do that, you were revisiting the labels and the wall text that you had originally written 7 years before, maybe a little more than that. And the art hadn't changed, but a lot had happened in the world of cultural politics. And it caused you and me to reflect on how we think about the representation of classical myths in European art, especially with regard to the female protagonists in those myths. So Sonia, what was your dilemma precisely?
So my dilemma was that when we uncrated the works that had toured across the country in order to show them again in Ottawa, I saw them with fresh eyes and realized that down the line, 7 years, 8 years after having looked at them so intensely, there were a lot of details that I had not originally noticed. And the first thing I was struck by, and that should really not ever have been a surprise, is the type of roles that women were often cast in Christian iconography. Like the infamous Whore of Babylon, and we can talk about her a little bit later on. And then I also noticed that in the section of the exhibition, Beautiful Monsters, on Greco-Roman myths, I noticed how violent some of the beasts were towards women. And I was dumbfounded that I hadn't picked up on this before. So I started questioning my own way of looking at images. And I realized that as an art historian, perhaps I had been desensitized to this violence for the sake of aesthetics. So, for instance, in images where tritons are marine deities that, a little bit like sirens, are half men, half fish. In images where tritons are grabbing onto women and dragging them into the depths of the water, somehow I hadn't noticed how violent those representations are. And they really are quite astoundingly violent in their physicality. And ultimately, this was problematic because I could not, in 2019, after, as the world was changing, I could not simply not talk about this. So I had to revisit my text, and I felt that I had a moral duty to speak about these issues, to speak about the violence against women in classical myths. Even if I could only do it very briefly, because as you know, Erika, our labels have to be about 60 words long. So that's very, very, brief. But nevertheless, I started to do that. And that's when you and I started talking about these issues and sort of, exchanging ideas about how to interpret these works differently.
Yeah, because what I noticed when I started reflecting upon it, that like you, as a trained art historian, I kind of just took the subject matter of factly. If I was doing some kind of analysis on a work of art and I didn't know the iconography, I knew it was, Greek and Roman, I would look it up, and find out what it was. But it was very kind of procedural, But it is true that the subjects from classical literature, especially the Metamorphoses by the Roman poet Ovid, are frequently about rapes or abductions or attempted abductions of women, nymphs, goddesses, such as Europa, Proserpina, and Daphne, and we'll talk a little bit about them. So I think it's quite easy to get desensitized. And I think you noticed when you looked at Ovid that there's like over 50 rape scenes in Ovid. So, and they're also extremely common in the visual vocabulary of European art as well. But interesting, the scenes portrayed, even if they're quite violent, like you're talking about, and we'll look at a few images shortly, they're usually about the pursuit, not the actual violation, which also can make it easy to forget the full impact of the violent assault, I think. And then also with the beauty of the representations, which allow us to forget the horror of the story. And it's been very interesting. You brought me to my attention a classics professor, Stephanie McCarter, who's at the University of the South in Sewanee, Tennessee. And she's currently translating Ovid's Metamorphoses, and she'll be the first female translator of the epic into English verse. And she noticed that when she went back to the original, that the language in the original Latin verse was direct and quite explicit in ways that the translations weren't, the translations that have been handed down to us through the ages, and it was translated many, many times in many different languages.
Yeah.
And the language was softened in the translations. Yeah.
Precisely. So for instance, in passages where Ovid would have used the Latin word for rape, translators often, even in very, very recent translations, softened these scene descriptions with expressions such as she was ravished by his beauty, or she gave away her virginity. So the work that Professor McCarter is conducting at the moment to recover the original language used by Ovid himself in writing the Metamorphoses is really, really important, because it is telling us that there's a long history of misinterpretation and also of sanitizing of the ancient myths. And to give a direct example of how I, as an art historian, had to rethink of one of the artworks in my exhibition, Beautiful Monsters, in light of this new knowledge. We could mention Albrecht Dürer's The Abduction of Proserpina on a Unicorn, sort of a famous print that I can show you here, Erika, maybe while you describe it in your work.
Okay, and this is quite a dramatic print. It shows Pluto, the king of Hades or Hell, on horseback, and he's grabbing Proserpina and riding off with her. And the context is that Proserpina's mother was Ceres, the goddess of agriculture, who was quite pissed off at this, upset, worried. And she sought Proserpina everywhere and threatened destruction of all of humanity by withdrawing fertility from the earth if she could not find her. Jupiter promised to restore Proserpina to her mother, provided Proserpina had not eaten anything while she was in Hades. But sadly, she had eaten 6 pomegranate seeds, and for that reason, she was compelled to spend 6 months in Hades with Pluto and 6 months with her mother. And this has turned into kind of a poetic reasoning as to why we on Earth have the seasons, winter and summer. And what's interesting about the image here is he's quite he's not showing the actual rape scene, but Dürer is quite graphic about the violence of the actual abduction. Proserpina does look very terrified, and it's interesting to note that the unicorn's eyes echo Proserpina's really frightened expression.
Yeah, so in my original wall label for this work, I spoke about how Pluto had taken Proserpina to make her the queen of his realm. And when I came back to this text years later, I realized that my own language was sanitizing this story of rape. So I tweaked the text to say instead, not that he had made her the queen of his realm, but rather that he had taken her and forced her to live with him in the underworld. And, you know, to a certain extent, that's not even enough. But it is already a shift in how we think curatorially, art historically, and it also signals that as an institution, as a museological institution, we don't always have to be neutral. We can be critical. There's space for both contemplation and critical thinking at the gallery. And that to me was a bit of a revelation, because I gave myself the license to speak in those words.
Yeah, no, I agree entirely. You know, we're both trained as art historians, which is an established discipline, an intellectual pursuit. And, you know, it's very easy in that realm of, you know, neutrality is a big word in journalism, but it also is in many academic subjects, you know. So it's very easy to forget, I think, the real trauma of sexual assault when we study these images. But like for you, you know, my attitude is changing in terms of how much of that thinking can be, you know, brought to life, and also just make what you do more interesting, more, makes me more, you know, curious about the Western tradition of, you know, the mind versus the body. And the balance is really weighted on the mind in the Western tradition. Anyway.
And, you know, just to pick up on that, I think for me, one of the works in Beautiful Monsters that really encapsulated what you just spoke about is this drawing by Marcantonio Raimondi of a female satyr. She's grabbing on to a sculpture in front of her, and she's screaming her lungs out. And it's an image that has always intrigued me. I'm going to show it to you. Hopefully, I think there's a little bit of reflection there, but hopefully you can get a sense of what's going on. So there's the female satyr with the hindquarters of a, what do you call that animal?
A goat.
A goat. And she's holding on to this sculpture and she's screaming. So I was intrigued by this because I didn't understand exactly what was going on in this drawing. So when I did a little bit of reading about it, I realized that when Raimondi, the artist, sketched it out, he was looking at an ancient Roman sarcophagus. And on this sarcophagus is this sculpted or carved
relief.
Yeah. And he drew the very last figure on the end of that relief. And he left out a really important part of that narrative. So that behind her, normally on the sculptural relief, is actually a male satyr who's very clearly aroused and he's about to assault her. So it's an extremely violent representation from the Roman times. And this Renaissance artist, Marcantonio Raimondi, decides to leave the assailant out of his drawing. I thought that that was, kind of convenient in a way. But also what intrigued me is that if you're able to see behind her, the assault, the perpetrator of the assault has been replaced by a tree, which is, a very puzzling choice.
Yeah. Yeah, but what's interesting about that drawing is that even though he has removed that kind of key element, he still represented her pose in quite a graphic way and portrayed her horror quite effectively, I find. And often in painting, sometimes we don't see a hint of this kind of the terrified reaction of the woman. Like, for example, in a painting at the National Gallery, this, maybe you can show it, Sonia, by Guido Reni. It's 17th century. It's later than what you're looking at in your prints, but it's called The Abduction of Europa. And it's another myth from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and it shows Europa, the daughter of the king of Phoenicia, and she's demurely sitting on the back of a bull. But the bull is in fact Jupiter, and he's transformed himself into a white bull in order to trick her. And once she climbed onto his back, he whisked her away to the island of Crete, where she bore him 3 sons. So, it's all sanitized in a way. The actual, act of rape is not shown, and she's just demurely there going on for a ride on the back of the bull. So it's quite different from the Raimondi in that sense. And this subject also gets variously titled. It's often, like we call it, the more common way of saying the abduction of Europa, but it's also been called the rape of Europa. And it's true that the Latin rapio means to seize, so abduction may technically be a more accurate translation. But the English word rape actually tells us more about the truth of the story, as opposed to the image, which has made it into almost a consensual act.
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt. Go ahead.
That's okay. No, do you want to say something before I go on? Because I'm going to shift a bit.
Yeah, I just, what you were talking about really reminded me of what I went through with my Picasso exhibition on a large suite of prints, where, there are different images of mythological creatures like not a satyr, a minotaur attacking a woman. And in one specific print where it's hard to tell what's going on. There's like a jumble of 2 bodies, basically. And Picasso did not give it a title, but scholars in the literature have given it different titles. And it goes from the embrace to the rape. So it's interesting to see how really sometimes it's really just a matter of interpretation. And, in that exhibition, I struggled so much with those titles that I decided not to include any titles because Picasso had not himself titled the works. And I instead explained in my wall text that the titles, the embrace, and alternatively the rape, were actually given by scholars after Picasso made the actual artwork. So I thought it was important to explain that.
Yeah. And I wonder if you might make a different decision today, knowing the source they're based on. But anyway, that's another, we can't, that's a bit of a diversion, because I wanted to get all around to the fact that not everything that you were faced with had to do with mythological scenes. Christian iconography can also pose a problem. And you mentioned the Whore of Babylon at the beginning. Can you tell me what's going on with her?
Yeah, all right. So the so-called Whore of Babylon is a symbolic female figure that appears in the last book of the Bible, the book called the Book of Revelation, or also the Book of the Apocalypse. And she is basically a personification of all that is evil in the world. And her full name, as spelled out in the Bible itself, and I'm going to read this out to you, is Babylon the Great, the mother of prostitutes and abominations of the earth. Now, in the exhibition Beautiful Monsters, there is a representation of the Whore of Babylon by Albrecht Dürer, the German Renaissance artist whom we talked about earlier with the rape of Proserpina. And Dürer produced this image as an illustration to his own Bible. He decided, you know, as a commercial venture that he would publish the Bible, and he illustrated it with these very fanciful images. So here is his version of the Whore of Babylon. So that's, there she is, very sort of elegantly dressed. She's holding a goblet in her hands, and she's riding a seven-headed beast.
She's on the left. She's the figure that we can see to the left.
Yeah, sorry, it's a very dense image.
Yeah.
So when I thought about what I wanted to say about the Whore of Babylon and looking at this title of her, this name that had been given to her, the mother of prostitutes and the abominations of the earth, I thought, what can I say in 60 words to encapsulate, you know, what is going on in this image? So I thought, why don't I just cite the Bible, because that's precisely what Dürer was looking at when producing the image, is the text that would have been next to this image in the book itself. So I started writing out that verse in my label, and it starts with a woman sitting on a scarlet beast full of names of blasphemy with 7 heads and 10 horns. And then when I read the rest of that sentence, I thought to myself, ooh, it's getting a little obscene. Maybe I'll just leave that second part out because I don't want to, you know, sound too obscene to our visitors. And within the span of 30 seconds, and, you know, I'm sure that you and I talked that afternoon, because that's the kind of thing that just gets my creative juices going, you know, that's when I pick up the phone or you come down to the office and we hash these things out. I thought, why am I censoring myself? And mostly, why am I censoring the Bible? So within that 30 seconds in my mind, I went back and wrote the rest of that verse. And the rest, in fact, is, quote, she is bearing a golden goblet in her hand full of abominations and filthiness of her fornication. And I thought that those were such strong words.
Yeah.
That you know, it would be wrong to leave them out.
Yeah.
And in fact, Dürer, you know, takes this quite, not literally, he actually almost does the opposite and portrays her in a very elegant way. But what's actually going on is that he portrays her as a Venetian courtesan. And he would have seen Venetian courtesans when he went to Venice. He traveled to Venice, and he would have witnessed these beautiful costumes, the traditional headdress. And so it's interesting how, you know, you have this very strong language, and then Dürer's sort of interpretation that is also in a way almost sanitized, although we know that courtesans, in addition to being very sort of, how do you say, someone who's well-cultured?
Sophisticated.
Yeah, sophisticated women, they also sold, you know, their bodies for physical pleasure. So
yeah, well, I think having the full quote there makes it a much more interesting, because it's so it's so opposite in a way. So I think that makes it more interesting for the audience as well. We had more to say, but I think I'm going to say a few final comments, and then we'll take a quick peek at the questions.
Go through the comments and see if there are any questions for us.
Just to kind of sum it up a little bit, that this is a very serious topic, but I have found that coming to new ways of understanding with a new emotional depth, which acknowledges the emotional power of the violent images that we find in a lot of European art, has made my work much more meaningful. And I know from our discussions that you feel similarly. It's been a great reminder how a lot of European art is about the age-old story of struggle, the dynamics of the power relations between people, often the different sexes, and the utter vulnerability of being human on the planet Earth, and the beauty and the terror of life. And so can't get much closer to art and life than kind of wrestling with those issues. Anyway, do you see any good questions?
No, I don't see any questions. A lot of hellos. So hello back to you.
Yeah.
Your questions. Oh, I was wondering, okay, let's see. I was wondering about how we should handle this topic, given that Greek and Roman myths are so popular for children now. I have very fond memories of the Europa painting from childhood gallery visits. That's a really tough one. Erika, I know you had some ideas about what to do in the galleries to sort of bring these works up to speed.
Well, that's different than dealing with the children issue. I don't know, because I think Ovid poetically it's a stunning piece of work, and I know a lot of people, not art historians necessarily, but a lot of people love Ovid for good reasons. And I think, as we said, the language can be quite strong if you have a direct translation. But for children, there are translations, I think, that are meant for children. And then, I mean, it must be up to the parent to decide when to bring the more kind of, but that would be true for any subject, I think, when you bring in the real aspects of life. I think it's, works of art too, it must be said, that can be appreciated at different levels and in different ways. And I think that's what our conversation has also pointed out, that, there isn't one true, even though, as the institution, the great neutral institution, we kind of in historical times have maybe thought that, there's different ways to think and different ways to see. And yeah, so that's my answer. Do you have any comments about that, Sonia?
That's a really tough one.
Oh, I think we're
and I think our take now.
Yeah, it's cutting off again. It did this. I'm just going to plug my thing in, but it did this for the French as well. It's so annoying. I don't know what's going on.
Can you hear me now? And
I do, intermittently.
So, well, why don't we go to the last question and then wrap it up in case we have more technological problems. So Monique is asking us, would you ever consider a future exhibition that deals with these issues? And she's speaking about the Me Too movement, for instance.
I think so. Would you?
Yeah, I think there's, our collections are so rich. There's so much we can do with them. In the prints and drawings collection, we have, for instance, over 30,000 works that speak to so many different issues. Can give me any topic and I can come up with a selection, So yeah, that would be something that we could envision doing, even just with our existing collections, without any loans, and just reinterpreting what we have in the galleries. Here, Anne is asking us, can you cite any examples where men are victims? So I think that in Ovid, actually, there is violence towards men, but I don't know. Erika, do you know?
I don't know them either. In Christian iconography, there obviously is. There are a lot of martyrs in Christian iconography. But so I don't have an easy answer about the men in the myths.
The men
it's a good question.
And, eaten by dragons, but it's not usually sexual violence. So I think that's
right. Well, there's that. Yeah. What's the Goltzius you just purchased? What's that subject?
So yeah, they're being devoured by a dragon. But it's nothing to do with their sexuality.
Right. And just maybe on a different note, kind of a more uplifting note that kind of goes back to that question about, in interacting with the myths at different levels. I came across, and I shared it with you, an extremely beautiful song the last song written by Kate McGarrigle, which is about the mother missing Proserpina, who's been abducted and taken away from her. And it's an absolutely beautiful song, heartbreaking. Um, but her daughter, Martha Wainwright, sings it. And if you just look for it on YouTube. And so that's, you know, the stories take on, you know, it doesn't have to always be about sexual politics. I don't think we should ever be blind to that, but it doesn't have to rule everything. And
Yeah.
that's maybe
And
a,
that
it's a sad
that song,
song. Hmm?
yeah, but it's really about the relationship of a mother and her daughter.
And that she's lost, which, you know, or she thinks she's lost. Anyway,
Yeah, that's a really
it,
interpretation.
yeah. Do we have time? Maybe, did you see one more where we got like maybe a minute?
No, I think we're at the cutoff mark, unfortunately.
Okay.
But I think that's all. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Erika.
Thank you, Sonia. It's always a pleasure.
Yeah. So tune in
Till
next
next.
week, guys. Same time, 3 o'clock, to hear our colleagues. Bye,
Bye.
everyone. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.